The Civil Rights Movement. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower named Earl Warren as its Supreme Court Chief Justice, a man who would become the most liberal judge in U.S. history. The following year, in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in the defining landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. News of this monumental decision in the nation's history was broadcast in 35 languages on the Voice of America Overseas radio network. President Eisenhower was hesitant to enforce the Supreme Court's decision, and unlike Truman, his predecessor, he did not wish to take considerable action in civil rights. Eisenhower did not openly speak out against the court's decision, but his silence to the American people may have expressed slight resistance. Before the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Ed, many public schools had mandatory segregation laws in place. The ruling was unpopular and garnered counteraction. In 1955, the Supreme Court issued a second order, Brown II, forcing all public school systems throughout the country to desegregate as immediately as possible. In Indianola, Mississippi, on July 11, 1954, a group of largely middle and upper-class whites established the White Citizens Council to oppose desegregation. Using economic and political influence as well as violence and intimidation, the council avidly countered civil rights goals and oppressed blacks both economically and socially. August 28, 1955, 14-year-old African-American Emmett Till from Chicago was murdered by two white men, J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant, in Mississippi for supposedly whistling and flirting with a white woman. The men were brought on trial but were acquitted by an all-white jury. The case became one of the most controversial and highly debated topics of the civil rights movement. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, a member of the NAACP, refused to give her seat up to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, violating a Southern tradition. Ms. Parks' defiance sparked mass protests and initiated action for a year-long boycott in Montgomery against public segregated facilities. Supporters of the boycott selected Baptist preacher Martin Luther King Jr. to lead the newly founded Montgomery Improvement Association. Galvanized by Indian nationalist Mohandas Gandhi's words of nonviolence to actualize a civil society of tolerance and justice, Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as an influential key luminary throughout the civil rights movement. The boycott ended in victory on December 21, 1956, after 381 days. Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957. Pressure from both the NAACP and the Brown decisions, the Little Rock School Board formed a plan to integrate its schools. Daisy Bates, president of the Arkansas NAACP, and her husband, Elsie Bates, a writer for an influential African-American newspaper, selected 9 individuals believed to have the courage and strong spirit ready to handle the intense hostility expected of the integration. Eisenhower did not necessarily support the court's ruling in the Brown v. Board of Ed case. As president, he believed his duty was to enforce the laws of the Constitution. On September 2, 1957, hostile mobs and rioters barred the entrance of Central High School to the Little Rock Nine. Motivated politically, Governor Orval Faubus refused to allow the first African-American students into Central High by utilizing the National Guard. Eisenhower initiated a meeting with Governor Orval Faubus and warned him not to interfere with the ruling of the Supreme Court. Faubus removed the National Guard only to replace them with the Little Rock Police. On September 24, 1957, Eisenhower responded by calling in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army to protect the 9 African-American students entering Central High School. President Eisenhower's choice of action signified the mark of the use of military power upon the states and the enforcement of federal law. During a nationally televised address, Eisenhower claimed the violence and hostility existing in Little Rock tarnished U.S.'s reputation and influence as well as fueled the groundwork for communist propaganda. Never did the president say his actions were taking place because it was ethically to do so according to the principles of the U.S. Constitution. For the remainder of the school year, the troops stayed at Central High.
In 1957, Eisenhower signed the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. A majority of southern states did not allow most of the African American population to vote. The new law enacted federal protection for those with due voting rights. Unfortunately, the signed legislation was insubstantial, as Southern Democrats successfully passed an amendment requiring a jury trial to rule out if a citizen had or had not been given his or her right to vote. This was a brilliant political move on the Democrats' part, because African Americans were not allowed to serve on juries. In September of 1958, Faubus shut down the public schools in Little Rock. Even after Eisenhower expressed his regret for the desperate and eager struggle for all Americans to be entitled to a rightful public education, he did not proceed with any more action. Eisenhower sternly confided in that he must maintain public civility, order, and peace, not hasten nationwide school desegregation. Upon finishing his term, only 6% of African Americans were admitted to and attending desegregated schools. Following in 1960, Eisenhower signed a second civil rights law. This law, however, only appended minor progressive propositions and moved over the initial first law. Throughout his presidency, Eisenhower appointed judges of liberal and open backgrounds to courts on the federal level, accelerating the civil rights of the 1950s. Eisenhower allowed for the continued desegregation of federal facilities in the nation's capital and the military troops that had begun in Truman's presidency. Although Eisenhower had a considerable involvement in civil rights, he did not suggest that desegregation occur rapidly, but rather slowly over time. Eisenhower remained sympathetic to the plight of whites in the South who claimed that integration destroyed their way of life. In Eisenhower's view, those who demanded immediate desegregation and constitutional rights due to them, as well as prevented federal courts' decisions, were extremists. June of 1958, Eisenhower met up on one occasion with African American leaders. The appeals for aggressive federal action to progress civil rights deeply bothered the president. More so, Eisenhower did not listen to Martin Luther King Jr. in regards to using the bully pulpit of the presidency to popularize racial integration. Ultimately, as president, Dwight D. Eisenhower failed to act as the moral compass in the fight for civil rights throughout the 50s, and the issue continued to divide the country in Kennedy's time. The Montgomery boycott led to the organization of the clergy-led Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, in 1957, with King selected as its president. 1960 presidential election. Civil rights was seen as the utmost significant issue. Before the election, Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested in Atlanta, Georgia, for leading a protest. Mr. Kennedy phoned King's wife, Coretta Scott King, to inform her of his concern and desire to take action. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, called a judge to ensure King's release from prison. John F. Kennedy's involvement won him a favorable image among the African American community. He swept up over 70% of the black votes in the 1960 election, providing him the win in several major states. Kennedy's narrow win of the White House in 1960, however, led him to be cautious. He did not harshly push for civil rights legislation in fear of losing support from Southern Democrats in Congress. Kennedy rather strengthened the Civil Rights Commission and appointed African Americans to high-level government positions, in addition to expressing his favor for school desegregation. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was appointed by Kennedy as head of the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. Attorney General Robert Kennedy directed his efforts to voting rights, commencing about 5 times more suits than in the Eisenhower administration. February 1, 1960. 4 African American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter, but were denied service. Taking a stand against racism, the students openly refused to leave their seats. The students' defiance garnered immediate support, and more than 50 other students participated to continue the sit-in. In weeks, protests and sit-ins spread to various other college campuses, reaching more than 65 cities in 12 southern states. Roughly 50,000 young black people in America joined the protests in 1960. President Kennedy may have been deliberate in advancing civil rights, but African Americans desired change. The administration was impelled to progress. 100 years after the Civil War, public facilities in the South were still racially segregated under Jim Crow laws. The Congress of Racial Equality coordinated integrated freedom rides to oppose segregation in interstate transportation. Freedom riders were subject to relentless and violent acts by federal police and mobs. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, in an attempt to protect the freedom riders, sent out 400 federal marshals and pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission to command the desegregation of interstate travel.
1962, James H. Meredith Jr. was the first African American to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Federal marshals escorted Meredith the day he tried to register for classes, but violence burst out from the mobs, leading to dozens of injuries and a total of 2 deaths. President Kennedy was left with no choice but to mobilize the National Guard and deliver additional federal units to the college campus. Meredith safely registered and attended his classes the following day, ending segregation at the University of Mississippi. Martin Luther King Jr. and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth organized an accumulation of mass protests in Birmingham, Alabama, around the spring of 1963. The demonstrations proved to have an insignificant impact at first, but on Good Friday, King was arrested and spent the next couple of weeks in jail. This is when King produced one of his most famous meditations on racial injustice and civil disobedience, Letter from Birmingham Jail. James Bevel, one of King's young lieutenants, called for young blacks to march in the streets of Birmingham City. Police dogs and high-pressure hoses were utilized by Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor in order to demolish the efforts. About 1,000 black youths were arrested in the May of 1963. In response, President Kennedy commissioned several thousand troops to an Alabama air base. Meanwhile, his administration accelerated the drafting of a comprehensive civil rights bill. Governor George Wallace of Alabama assured to preserve segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. When two African American students attempted to enroll at the University of Alabama in the summer of 1963, Wallace affirmed his promise to stand in the schoolhouse door. After President Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard on June 11, he delivered an address to the people. Kennedy characterized the fight for civil rights as moral, constitutional, and legal. In his address, he had disclosed to the public that significant civil rights legislation would be admitted to the Congress. The legislation would guarantee equal access to public facilities and services, end segregation, and provide federal protection of the right to vote. The centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation was celebrated by more than 200,000 Americans in the August of 1963. A high point in the civil rights movement, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom left many hopeful for social change without violence and confrontation in the promising future. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial at the nation's capital, Americans were deeply moved by the soaring rhetoric of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
In the fall of 1963, the Comprehensive Civil Rights Bill settled conflicts in Congress and gained favor from House and Senate Republicans. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on the 22nd of November in 1963. The bill had not yet been passed and was left to President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration. Johnson made use of his political ties with Southern white congressionals and support from Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, as well as the overflowing emotion in the aftermath of such a beloved president's death, to pass the bill. The legislation's provisions included 1. Protection for African Americans against discrimination in voter qualifications. 2. Outlaw of discrimination in hotels, motels, restaurants, and theaters, and all other public accommodations engaged in interstate commerce. 3. Authorization of the U.S. Attorney General's Office to file legal suits to enforce desegregation in public schools. 4. Authorization of the withdrawal of federal funds from programs practicing discrimination. And 5. Outlaw discrimination in any business exceeding 25 people and created an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to review any complaints. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed on July 2, 1964, in honor of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy.